Hello, everyone, and welcome to our strategic conversation today with Parag Khanna. Parag, thank you for joining us from Singapore. Parag, you need no introduction to this global audience. So we all know you, we've heard you, we've seen you on television, we've read your books. And your book, The Future is Asian, which is your latest book, is of course a must read for anyone who wants to understand what's happening today in Asia, but also the past and the future. So we're really, really pleased to have you here with us. You're also a leading global strategy advisor, and you have your own firm called Future Map. So friends, if you've been following our strategic conversations for these months that we've been in lockdown, you know that we live in a very troubled world. COVID-19 has impacted very strongly on our societies, on our economies, but also on global geopolitics. But now, as we cautiously, carefully, step by step come out of the lockdowns across the world, some more quickly than others, we have to start thinking of what happens next. And there, of course, we all know that this recovery will have to be a global effort. We'll all have to work together. And that means Europe and Asia will have to work together. Today is a very special day for Friends of Europe because we're devoting all morning session to our relationship between Europe and Asia and looking at how we're going to be working together, not just in the search for a new vaccine, but also a global effort at recovery, at helping those who have been worst hit by the crisis. But as we start this conversation, I'm really happy that Parag, you are here. And my question to you, my first question would be, here in Europe, we're talking a lot about the Asian century, but some people, and quite a few people, are saying, hey, wait a minute, this is not an Asian century, this is actually a China century. So let's have your comments on that, please.
Sure. It's great to be with you, Shada. Thanks so much for including me. And I suppose this is the closest we can get to that in-person conversation that we had planned, but in due course, we'll get to do that as well. Look, one of the primary reasons why I wrote the book is precisely to point out that it is an Asian story and that China is an integral part of that story, but it is not the sum total of that story. You have an Asia without China. You have a China without the rest of Asia, but it's the two together that have actually led to this dramatic transformation in the global power balance that we feel today. And the story really begins with Japan in the post-war decades. It was Japan that inspired the tiger economies, Japan and the tiger economies that inspired China, and now Japan, the tiger economies, and China that are collectively leading the investments into the fourth wave of Asian growth economies, South and Southeast Asia. You have a collective story of 4.5 billion people. And so I think that, I won't dwell on this too much in this conversation, but I've gone to great lengths to point out that people who simply want to identify one nation at any given time as the locus of power in the global system really don't understand the history or global history, as it were, which is much more about broader regional sweeps rather than singular powers. And we should never fall victim to a very, very parsimonious theoretical approach that doesn't really have sufficient grounding in reality.
Thank you very much for Parag. I think that's absolutely important now to correct that impression, and you've done it brilliantly as well. Let's turn to Asia today and how the COVID-19 is impacting on Asian societies, on Asian economies. Asia's coming out of it. Asia was struck first by the pandemic. How is Asia being transformed? What are the trends you're seeing in this changing world?
Well, probably the most significant impact globally of COVID on economics, potentially even geopolitics, was underway before the pandemic, and that was regionalism. Right? It was before the pandemic that you had the US-China trade war and the attempts at decoupling. Suddenly, North American trade was greater internally than with the rest of the world. European trade has in any case for decades been largely internal. And in Asia, you have found that Asians trade more with each other than the rest of the world. It was before the pandemic that Asian countries passed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, to further integrate their trade. So regionalism, which of course, again, builds on the first point we were discussing, is going to continue, because just imagine, how long is it going to be before people will regularly take, in large volumes, transcontinental flights? It will be a long time. Our reopening is going to be incremental and regional. right, within Asia, within Europe, within North America. That's just going to reinforce what was happening already. So Asians are also learning from each other. This embrace of technology in Asia, as we've seen with the contact tracing apps, is going to internationalize as countries learn from each other how to conform to each other's requirements around geolocation and medical reporting and that kind of thing. As you see, Asians do not have any inhibitions about embracing these technologies and deploying them. That's going to be very helpful for Asia and its recovery.
So Parag, when we were speaking a few days earlier, you talked to me about how we're moving towards a 3-speed world. And I was wondering if you could be elaborate a bit about this 3-speed world rather than just 2-speed world.
Mm-hmm. We used to think about the world as 2-speed, emerging economies and developed markets, but now I would say it's a North America, Europe, Asia kind of a trifurcation. And clearly the stimulus policies that have been undertaken are largely meant to benefit, of course, the domestic consumption market in each country. There's some spillover effects. The nearshoring of supply chains, that's also going to re-regionalize. This is something that Europe now is also trying to do quite strongly. It also obviously echoes to some degree what the Trump administration is trying to do. Whereas, of course, in Asia, most of the supply chains already are national or regional. And you'll see some shifts as countries move supply chains out of China into Southeast Asia. But again, that just deepens regionalism. So, Asia will be the only region of the world this year that will record any growth whatsoever. Some countries within Asia, of course, some of the emerging markets will have significant economic corrections. China may have slightly positive growth, but on the whole, to the extent that there is a recovery at all, it's not a global one. It's very much an Asian one, and it's a race to recover in many ways, given this kind of 3-pole, 3-pillar kind of system that we have. So again, the facts are that Asia is going to come out of this, faster than other regions of the world. And again, it has the demographic foundations, the consumption markets, the recovery of mobility for the consumer and travel sector and so forth. The industry is here, finance is here, and some of the monetary policies that are necessary to ensure flexibility are also there. So I think Asia has things aligned pretty well.
And do you see any potential for actually dialogue, consultation, even cooperation between these 3, as you've said, 3 poles in a sense, 3 regions, 3 different systems coming together? Do you see any chances of collaboration? Because at the moment, Parag, things are not looking good.
No, and I think that, we should not hold relations across the major centers of gravity in the world hostage to a single issue. Historically, that's the recipe for disaster. It's not that there cannot be tension, it's that one issue, whether it is military or economic or cultural or whatever the case may be, cannot hold hostage, these relationships. That's critical. And here I would say again, I've always emphasized that in this multipolar framework, we should not treat the West as a coherent, unified bloc. And this goes back more than 15 years, really. If you think about some of the divergence in transatlantic relations, it dates back to the post 9/11 geopolitical interventions of the United States. So we're talking about 20 years now, where Europe has genuinely been trying and struggling and succeeding in many ways to find its own voice in economic issues. So let's take, why does this matter? Well, if you look at Europe's strategy towards Asia, on the one hand, yes, it is talking tougher on China. It has a strategic industrial policy that's more coherent now. It is doing investment screening. But at the same time, last year, it passed a free trade agreement with Japan. It would like to have a similar trade engagement with Southeast Asia, with India, which is very different from the United States approach, of course, which has been trade war, tariffs, and pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement. So it's not really sensible to talk about a Western policy towards China or Asia. Rhetorically, there may be similarities. That's fine. In reality, however, you and I both know very well that in Brussels, in Frankfurt, in London, in Paris, there's a very different conversation about being part of the some countries, the Belt and Road Initiative, joining the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, pursuing these free trade areas. And of course, geography would dictate that this be the case. And I think that's perfectly normal. that Europe have this posture that's quite different and quite frankly a lot more constructive than that of the United States.
Absolutely. Let me just turn now to our audience. If you have a question, a comment to make, please go on Twitter, hashtag FOE debates, and my colleague Amanda will send me your question and I'll put it to Parag. So Parag, I remember now, I think it was a couple of months ago, maybe a year ago even, you were in Brussels talking about Eurasian connectivity. And I think the points you were making then are still very relevant, especially saying what you've just said, which I think is absolutely something I agree with. But often we're given a binary choice, and we find ourselves like Asians, like Southeast Asia and others, saying you're either with the United States or you're with China. And I think the challenge really for all of us is to have our own leadership identity and to work on our own constructive relationships with both. So this connectivity issue comes into it as well, because the BRI is seen as a very globally ambitious geopolitical move by China. And of course, America is telling many of us not to be part of it. Can I have your comments, please?
I've often found that it takes a non-European to continuously stoke Europe to be more confident, and it's a role that I've been playing since I moved to Germany when I was in high school. As a teenager, I've been very pro-European, sort of an American who's very pro-European, who happens to be Asian. So I'm trying to see everyone's side of the story, but most consistently, I think I've been pro-European. And one of the things that I've pointed out, as a matter of fact, is that in the past 30 years, since the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, Europe has still undertaken the most transformative investments to its east, right? More transformative than Chinese investments to its west have been, so to speak, right? The enlargement of the European Union itself is the most fundamental evidence of that. So I always like to remind Europeans that they have the most successful track record of state transformation, modernization, democratization, and inclusion and embedding in institutions. That's not something that any Asian power has successfully managed to do yet. And it's not likely to happen given the fault lines and confrontations that exist within Asia. So that's one reason why Europeans should be very confident. Another is that, quite frankly, the European process tends to learn from crisis, right? It takes a crisis such as this for Europeans to come together and realize that monetary policy now has to be complemented with a common fiscal policy, that given the divergence in terms of strategic orientation with the United States that goes back 20 years, now Europe, of course, has to be much more self-reliant. And obviously things have happened along the way in the US, like the transition through these different administrations, and of course now the kind of pinnacle of unreliability being the Trump administration. Now Europe really cannot wait and see. So there are many reasons why, and I think also just generational change in consciousness, right? So I still have that optimism that Europe can align these stars, and now also again being tough, in the case of China with the reciprocal demands for market access and how Belt and Road is managed and pushing sustainability and ESG governance. We do look to Europe still globally for these regulatory roles that it plays. So again, it's not this false choice, choose between, first of all, as we know, it's not really a choice between China and the US. In global trade, Europe is more important than both, right? So it's really about having, I think that Europe's problems are largely, internal. I'll just make one last point. Again, from the American point of view, I've watched for many years that Europeans have complained America has been dividing us. Over new Europe versus old Europe with the Iraq War. The Russians are dividing us, right? Should Russia be allowed to invest in energy projects and utilities or not? Now the Chinese are dividing us over 16+1 in Belt and Road. At some point, given that Europe is, 600 million of the wealthiest people in the world, with such an incredible legacy, playing victim, 3 times in the last 20 years is not really the way to view it, right? It is Europe's own fault if it cannot manage these situations. So again, I view this as an internal issue much more than an external one.
Yes, thank you very much. I think you and me both are perhaps talking the same narrative that Europe does have the ability, the capacity to be more self-confident internally and on the global stage. So perhaps you're right, it does take an Asian-born European in my case, and then perhaps also Asian-born American in your case, to bring those points to the fore. So thank you very much for that. Parag, let's move now to your latest sort of work on mobility. And a very interesting article you wrote recently talked about how there would be certain changes in the way choices are made by people where they would live. And you said that this would be countries and cities that were considered good for your health, that health would be a dominant feature in this. Just explain a tiny little bit more.
Sure. I mean, it's so striking, Shada. December 2019, we were able to look back and say that 2019 was a high watermark. We had never had so many international tourists and business travelers in history as the year 2019. The stock of total international migrants was 275 million people, again, more than ever in history. And then came the pandemic. But clearly migration has many, many drivers, from economic dislocation, technological automation, labor imbalances, political unrest and violence, and of course now, on top of all of those motivations, the shift, people's desire to shift from red zones to green zones, right? From unhealthy to healthy places, or fleeing climate change, really, sort of, again, red zones to blue zones, you might say. Now, we have artificially suppressed international migration. At the moment, it is zero. But again, that will change because the same demographic imbalances persist, particularly in Europe, of course. And so what we will see is that perhaps, given the technologies that are now at play in terms of verifying people's travel history and then health immunity and so forth, countries will find new ways to more efficiently determine which migrants they want to bring in and in which ways they need them and so forth. And you found, if you just take Brexit, Boris Johnson has turned around and said, he's recognized the labor shortages that they have in the UK market and realized that they actually have to have a more Canadian style, more efficient, more points-based, sector-focused system that's depoliticized and focused on needs. All of those needs still exist. And now the demand to move is going to be greater than ever after this pandemic. So I'm trying to do a global study of the future of human geography. And I'll just point out that this is incredibly geopolitical. When you study geopolitics properly, you don't ignore demographics, right? And this goes back either millennia or certainly to the 19th century when geopolitics became a field. You have to think about demographics. In a world where the population is actually beginning to level off, Shada, I mean, the world population will probably never reach 9 billion people, which is much less than we thought the peak human population would be. I actually believe we will start to compete. Today we talk about protectionism, nationalism, xenophobia, walls, and borders. I would say we're just months, years, not even, away from a world where we're competing for human beings, for labor, for talent, to augment our economies, because the pandemic has laid bare just how much our economies actually depend on human mobility, consumption, and social interaction.
Absolutely. It's interesting, this conversation. We had this with the European Commissioner for Home Affairs, Ylva Johansson, just a week ago, really. And she was pointing out something that we've all seen, how COVID-19 has spotlighted the role of essential workers who, are mostly of migrant backgrounds. And so the narrative here in Europe is suddenly changing in saying that, yes, we do need migrants. Of course, populists will always, not accept that. But I think it's up to our more reasonable, sensible politicians to make that point and to make that in a simple, understandable way. Final question to you, Parag, is actually about this idea now that we're decoupling. Globalization is endangered. Globalization is dead. We are all now nation states working, on our own national interests. So forget globalization. That's the past. Now we're going to be reshoring, bringing back our investments and bringing back jobs. Your comments?
I think, globalization is many different things. A lot of people who are cynical, negative, skeptical of globalization will pick one statistic and reify that and, make that represent all of globalization. But that's not the way it works, right? There's the mobility of people, of capital, of trade of goods, services, and so forth. And we have to take these things one by one. First of all, we have, in fact, an increase, of course, in services trade, right? The movement of knowledge, internet, data flows, and so forth. We've seen that increase in recent years, and certainly as a result of digitization with the pandemic, perhaps even more so. More efforts to lay down, high volume internet cables across and between the continents of the world. So that's more important in a way and more value added economically than some of the more traditional categories of globalization. There are certain categories of globalization that we should want actively to recede, which, and one obvious example is the oil trade. Does it really make sense that when you can have local renewable alternative energy sources, that you pump oil out of the ground and put it on tankers and ship it across the world and destroy our climate? Of course not. We should actively pursue deglobalization in some of these areas. And statistically, that may look like it's doing harm to globalization, but it's the greatest thing we could ever do. So it's not really a question of whether you are pro or against globalization. It's what is optimal. But now when it comes to the globalization that most people think of, which is the international trade in goods, let's remember that given this sort of tripolar world and the different regulatory zones and frameworks that are emerging, you cannot really sell or have dominant market share in some of the overseas geographies where a Western multinational, a European company, an American company that generates 30-40% of its revenue from Asia. How can it possibly maintain that market share unless it's making its cars, making its iPhones in Asian markets? And therefore, what you've found is that despite all the talk of deglobalization, executives in America and in Europe are saying, hold on, we may make back at home what we sell here within these borders, but we also have to make within other borders those things that we sell over there. And again, going back to the fundamental point, if Asia is the largest economic area in the world, has the fastest growing middle class, has the largest consumer base, you cannot avoid being Asian. You cannot avoid operating in Asia. So deglobalization is not really, it's not actually in the national interest anyway. Globalization would never have happened if it were not in the national interest. Now, there are some aspects where it's in the national interest to retrench. I have nothing against countries wanting to have some degree of a strategic industrial policy so that they can have redundancy, resilience in their production of essential items, whether they're industrial, medical, and so forth. That's perfectly logical. And optimal supply chain efficiency is not the way to run a fragile world. So I think that we will make these adjustments, we'll make these correctives, but there's very little evidence that we will sort of do away with these global dependencies that we have on reaching out to each other for technology and for market access and for talent.
Thank you very much, Parag. Thank you also for bringing in the question of how we're going to be racing and competing with each other to find the best talents in the world. Parag, thank you very much indeed for a very, very, I would say, informative, but also historically and geographically pointedly important to tell us where we are today in terms of China, Asia, Europe. And you've said some brilliant, I would say, inconvenient truths, which we need to really hammer home so that we can understand that this world is not necessarily heading for another Cold War or a tech war, but that we can, when we find it in ourselves, to work with each other, especially as we work towards a recovery. Parag, I will now let you go. And I'll say again, thank you very much for joining us in this strategic conversation. Friends, the conversation continues with our online discussion with 7 brilliant panelists on many of the issues that Parag has brought to the fore and that we will discuss in further detail. EU-China, EU-Japan, EU-India, ASEM, the Asia-Europe meetings, and a number of other issues. So thank you very much. Join us in about 5 minutes. Take care, stay safe, stay healthy. Thank you, Parag. conversation with Parag Khanna. And hello to those who are joining us for the first time. We are really, really privileged, I have to say very honored, to have a brilliant collection of 7 panelists from all over Europe and Asia to talk about Europe-Asia relations. Parag pointed out to the strong bonds between Europe and Asia, and all of my fantastic network of friends and colleagues that I've worked with for years on Europe-Asia relations. It's been one of my passions across my professional career. I've agreed very nicely to join me today to have a look at Europe-Asia relations today, the trade side, the political side, the geopolitical side, but also the people-to-people contacts in this world of COVID-19. And as we look into the recovery, the post-COVID-19 recovery, what are the different areas? Where are the priorities? What are our concerns? And how can Europe and Asia actually work together for the recovery, but also for sustainable development among our people, our economies, and our politicians? The situation at the moment, as you know, is quite tense. China and the US are entangled in a trade war, a tech war, and there are acrimonious words being exchanged. But at the same time, Europe and Asia are building bridges, working together, signing free trade agreements, having strategic conversations, talking about security. So there's a plethora of ideas and conversations that are going on and that are often and not reported in the mainstream media, also in Asia or in Europe. So let's delve deeper into this relationship. Let's look at what works and let's look at what doesn't work and how to make it better. Now, there are students from across Asia and Europe joining this conversation. Some of my students at College of Europe are here, and students of our other panelists are joining us as well. So please, if you have questions, go on Twitter and send us your questions, your comments on hashtag FOE debates. And my friend and colleague, Amanda, will take your questions and give them to the panelists. Now, let me introduce these panelists one by one. What an honor to have with us Dr. Shifu Lin, President of the China Institute for Reform and Development. Professor Shifu Lin, welcome. Thank you for joining us. And Wenfeng Wei, he's Deputy Director of International Cooperation, also at CIRD, who will say a few words on behalf of Dr. Shifu Lin in this panel. Absolutely great to see you again, Lewi. Lewi, we go back probably several decades when we've been working on the Asia-Europe meetings together, written several things together as well. So thank you for joining us from Singapore. You're director of Nanyang Technological University and you're at the EU Center there. So thank you very much. Jo Leinen, former chair of the European Parliament Delegation for Relations with China. Jo, thank you very much for joining us as well. I know you're involved in many, many interesting Asian initiatives, and we look forward to working with you on that. Also joining us, another old friend and a brilliant analyst, excuse me, Akiko Fukushima, Senior Fellow at the Tokyo Foundation. So welcome and joining us from Tokyo, Kiki. Mr. Zhang Lirong, Secretary General of the China Forum at Tsinghua University Center for International Security and Strategy. Mr. Lirong, welcome. Joining us now from Delhi in India is Selma Bava. She's John Monnet Chair and Professor at the JNU Center for European Studies. Selma, I saw you, I think, very briefly earlier this year when we could still travel. I was in Delhi and met you there, but it's wonderful to see you here and thank you for joining us. Last, but he's definitely not least, one of my closest friends, Bart Gaines, Senior Research Fellow at the Finnish Institute of International Relations. And Bart and I have also worked very closely together on issues to do with the Asia-Europe meeting and Asia-Europe relations. So friends, we have about just under an hour and a half to take our conversation forward. And I'm going to put the same question actually to all 7 of you to kick off with. And that is really, what lessons and experiences can we share as Europeans and Asians about the post-COVID-19 recovery? What can we bring together? Where can we cooperate? And what would, in your eyes, would be, say, 3 key priority areas where we should be working together? So let's start off with you, Dr. Shifu Lin, please.
Yeah, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, Sada and everybody. 1 minute Chinese 啊，要 translate OK。面对疫情对经济全球化的严重冲击啊，我想考虑更多的中欧要坚持多边主义，坚持投资贸易自由化，坚持双方经贸合作大局，从而呢深化中欧的投资贸易合作，这样呢在复杂多变的世界政治格局中发挥我们中欧两大经济体独特重要的作用。Thank you much.
Thank you, Dr. Shifulin. So Wenfeng, you will be kind enough now to give us some ideas of what Dr. Shifulin just said and the comments he wanted to make in more length. Please, Wenfeng.
Yeah. So Professor said in the face of severe impacts of this COVID-19 on economic globalization, and China and Europe need to stick to multilateralism and liberalization of trade and investment, and also China-EU bilateral cooperation on economy and trade, so that we can deepen China-EU trade and investment cooperation. And both Europe and China can play a unique, important role in the complex and changing world.
Thank you very much, Wenfeng. So I was now going to turn now to Lei Wei. Lei Wei, from your point of view, from your stance, where do we go now? Unmute, please.
Can you hear me?
Now, yes, go ahead.
Okay, good. I am having there's a very strange, yes. I think we see that the COVID-19.
Are you having a problem connecting, Lei Wei?
Echo.
Oh, you're having
yeah, so I hear two sets of things going on at the same time. I think it's sort of a lag, so it's been very confusing.
Is it getting better now? Should I move on and come back to you maybe while we fix it? Yeah. Should we try and fix it?
No, I have no problems connecting, but I hear two sets of conversations and echo. So I am having this.
Okay, you know what? We'll try and fix that. I think Lucien, our technical manager here, will try and fix that for you. And I'll move on now to Joe Leinen. So Joe, maybe perhaps you can come in with your insights, and Lei Wei, I'll come back to you in a second while we fix that. Joe, please. You'll have to unmute, Joe. Joe, you have to unmute, yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
No problem. Technology is wonderful when it works. Go ahead.
I think, Shada, we all have to learn some lessons from this corona crisis. And we could see the differences in managing the pandemic from country to country. You need somehow good governance. You have countries that are well governed and they manage better than those who are not so well governed. You need resilience. You need systems that can support crisis management, like a health system or a social system. And when I saw the pictures from India, and I think our colleague will come back later, I am just horrified. Our millions of people are just out of anything and no protection, no nothing. So I think there are some lessons to learn internally in every country. But of course, we have to learn as well a lot on the international level. And I think multilateralism and globalism is a necessity. And I fear, nevertheless, that depending how long this pandemic goes on, that we are as well in the danger of nationalism and protectionism. The economic downturn is quite severe in Europe, like in Asia. Look on Latin America, we don't know yet about Africa. So I don't hope that protectionism and nationalism is the outcome of Corona. And therefore, Asia, anybody who is good willing, and Europe, we should really stress the point that international cooperation, multilateralism in trade, in economics, but as well on different other issues like sustainability, social issues. Don't forget the politics like peace issues around the world, migration. So I think we have a lot to do even more after Corona than we had to do already before Corona.
Thank you very much, Joe. And you're absolutely right to point to the populist sort of backlash that's happening, and that we have to stand firm in favor of international cooperation and globalization. There are some very worrying trends here in Europe and in the United States, of course, that are calling on us to separate, to decouple, to reshore. And as I think we heard, yes, some of that reshoring is necessary for strategic reasons, but we cannot absolutely decouple. So thank you very much for that. Let me see, Lewi, are things a bit better on your side now when you speak? Unmute, please, and try again.
Yes, I think it's better. I think I had this strategic conversation going on. So I think that was on at the same time. And that's why I hear both, both sets of the thing. All right. So I think, we know that the COVID-19 actually has exacerbated many of the existing trends that we are already seeing, right? We talk about the increased tensions and rivalries between US and China. We see the pushbacks against globalization and the rise of economic nationalism, and of course increasing inequalities that are going to be fueled actually further by the digital divides that we see. So for Asia and Europe, I think as we work towards recovery, we need to be cognizant of these trends. I think our responses now, like you said, I believe in the agency of Asia and Europe and all the nation states, and we should not be just so caught up in these tensions between US and China and forget that we all have a role to play. So I felt that our responses now will determine what our future will be. So I think regional organizations such as the European Union and ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, particularly need to step up and exercise their agency and forge their own paths instead of being forced to choose between the US and China. And also in the trends towards, to a certain extent, you can say deglobalization, but towards regionalization, which I think Parag Khanna in the strategic conversations also talk about, that we are not reshoring, but there's a trend towards regionalization, which means you are going to have, of course, Asia trading in Asia more, and Europe, of course, in Europe. But this also opens up the fear that if we are not careful, we could lead to having very close competing blocks. And that's why I feel that the role of regional organizations like ASEAN and EU becomes very important, because we are the ones that can build these inter-regional links, because we already have the platforms. We have the EU-ASEAN dialogue, and we also have ASEM. And I think these platforms that join Asia and Europe become more important so that we do not move towards the trend of competing regional blocks that do not cooperate and which leads to, I think, in polarization of everyone. So I think it's important to bear that in mind. To navigate the tensions between China and US, I think, and in the absence of global leadership, the rest of the world, and that includes all of us here, needs really to step up with what I always call functional or issue-based leadership. I think we need to exercise much more agency and look at issue-based or what we call functional leadership. We have no global leadership, and I don't think we can expect anything, even from China. China is not able to step up to their role as a global leader because of the increasing, to a certain extent, a distrust of this role. So then the rest of us need to really step up to exercise what I call functional leadership to various constellations of what we call coalitions of the willing. And I think that's important to bear in mind. So when we seek to reform global multilateral institutions such as the WTO or the WHO, we need to maintain a patchwork of regional, inter-regional, or even sub-regional and functional institutions and forums that will continue to facilitate the coordination and cooperation needed to bring about recovery of the lives and livelihood of the people.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed for talking about the need for regions and interregional relations. Let me turn now to Tokyo and Kiki from Tokyo. I don't know what time it is in Tokyo. My head's spinning. I have no idea. But let's have your thoughts about Asia-Europe cooperation in these rather challenging moments.
Thank you. Is my microphone working?
Yes.
Good. As you said, strong bond between EU and Asia matters more than ever under this pandemic crisis. Japan has managed the first wave of infection. However, genuine control of the pandemic will not come into sight unless we can stop global spread of the pandemic. I believe this pandemic is a human security crisis. I mean it because it affects not only our health, but also economy, society, and even culture. This pandemic has deprived our freedom from fear, freedom from want, and freedom to live with dignity. Can we go back to our way of life, say 4 months ago? Perhaps not. We have to have new way of life. The new coronavirus has caused impact on all walks of life, and the virus does not carry passports. Therefore, our response has to be not only national, but regional and global. Our response should offer global common goods. Our response should not be stovepiping, but be comprehensive, covering all sectors involved. Blaming would not be our response. Blaming wouldn't help us to get out of this turmoil. I'm afraid the blaming will take us to global collapse. For health, we need to share information. We still do not have vaccines and medical treatment for the new coronavirus, and we cannot afford for duplicated efforts. Therefore, we have to share information. This is vitally important. And also, once vaccines and medical treatments are developed, it should be available to all people, all population, and it should be affordable. Japanese Prime Minister Abe proposed a pool of patents of these new medical treatments. I hope that would be considered around the globe and between Europe and Asia. For economies, we cannot simply blame globalization. No, deglobalization would not be the answer. Globalization has revealed the fragility of its aspect, particularly in the context of supply chains. But globalization has allowed us to share knowledge as well. So what I would like to see, if I may borrow from Joe, resilient globalization in future. And if I say including culture or sports, you may wonder, but I think all these fields are interrelated and have to be approached. No one, however mighty one may be, cannot go alone. Reigning multilateralism has to be reshaped to fit to post-corona world. And that's something I strongly believe EU and Asia can work together.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Kiki. So some very strong messages there as well. We can't go back to business as usual. I think that's a very important message. to hammer home. We can't do it alone. Also something that we have to remember as we become a little bit too cocky and self-confident in some parts of the world. And also that the vaccine has to be accessible and readily available and to all, and that there shouldn't be competition or hoarding of knowledge for that. Thank you very much indeed. Let me turn now to Mr. Zhang Lirong. And the question to you is, as we've heard from Parag and the dominant narrative here in Europe, and I will not use the word the West, because I do believe, as Parag said, that Europe and America are different. The dominant narrative really is that it's not an Asian century, it's really China's century. And here we're talking about the wider networks. Your thoughts, please, Lirong.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to say I'm very delighted to have the opportunity of taking part in Friends of Europe's event again. I'm happy to see you again. You remind me of the good old days in Brussels. And I'm also very happy to meet new colleagues from Europe and from my neighboring countries. First of all, I would like to share with you some information from the ongoing annual sessions of the Chinese People's Congress and the Political Consultative Conference. Apart from the domestic agenda, on the international front, strong messages are sent out. The first one is, COVID-19 is an unprecedented crisis. The virus respects no border or races. It poses challenge to all human beings without distinction. It requires that all countries should join hands in fighting the virus. China has been doing so as much as we can. And we are willing to go further on to work together with other countries. We have established, for example, a joint mechanism with the Republic of Korea for prevention and control of the virus. And we have also set up, for example, a joint group of experts, Chinese, European together. And we have, I think, held more than 160 visual conferences with medical experts with other countries. And we have also supported the COVID-19 response in 150 countries and international organizations. So that's one thing. China is willing to work together with other countries because we think the virus is our common enemy. If we don't beat the virus, no country is safe. And second, the Chinese economy was heavily hit by the COVID-19. We suffered a lot. But now the situation is under control and the production has been largely resumed. But we would also, apart from doing our own contribution to the world economy, we would also like to work together with other countries because we think we have to work together to stabilize the global economy. And in this respect, I quite agree that the world will not be the same as before, but the globalization will move on as much as the multilateralism. And in this respect, I think regional organizations like ASEAN and EU and international organizations like United Nations, WTO, and the economic organizations will have a bigger role to play. And Asian, Europe, or China, Europe, or we have to support those organizations and the regional arrangements to function better. Like we do hope that we can sign the RCEP agreement within the year, as well as, for example, the bilateral investment treaty between China and the EU within the year. So I think we have to move on, and no country can insulate itself from the global challenge or refrain from its international responsibility, and we have to work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Li Rong. I think you pointed to some very basic truths as well and made it very powerfully. I mean, if we don't beat the virus, no country is safe. No country can do it alone. And I think the thread that's running through our conversation, and Parag pointed it out as well, is regionalism, the importance of regional organizations. And as Lewi said, the focus is going to be very much on how regional organizations come together and work together for the recovery, but also for the well-being of the planet. Let's not forget the issue of climate change that has not gone away, even though now we're looking at the pandemic. The pandemic, to some extent, is the result of climate change or changes in biodiversity anyway. So thank you very much, Li Rong. We'll come back, and Dr. Shifulin, we'll come back to you as well. Salma, turning to you, and I'm not going to say for the Indian point of view, because you're an independent analyst, as we are all here. We don't represent a country. We represent our own ideas, and I think this is very important to underline in our conversations. We are all thinkers and strategists working in our own capacity. So Salma, your point of view on how things are changing and where we are going to be working together, or should be.
Thank you, Shada, and thank you for hosting all of us. I think it's so important in the current situation to continue conversations going. I think that is the key forward. And we have to find multiple formats to do that. I'm going to give two sets of points. One, I'm going to start with the state of play, and then I move on to what are my three key takeaways here. I think for the first time, what we're experiencing is that how the pandemic has unleashed really at a global scale, a global humanitarian crisis. It's not restricted to one part of the world. Never in our collective history are we all suffering together. I think that is the first important point to reposition ourselves. Second is the unprecedented scale. And what it has done, it has sharpened the geopolitical and the geoeconomic, and the geostrategic frames of reference. I think it has totally turned around what is our reference of status quo. I think it's a very, very fluid situation going ahead. Second, I think collectively, what we are also witnessing history being made in the sense of a very negative kind. The global population has, had a pushback in terms of health, well-being, and development, all being annulled in such a short span of time, and being pushed back into poverty, unemployment, and not knowing where the future is. I think this is, again, a new kind of reference point. It may have been there for a group of people, but not as a collective for the planet. Where do we move? A third thing has been that public health has always been taken for granted and has always been considered to be a national issue. I think for the first time, in this globalized setting, what we are experiencing is also that public health is a global public good. We always spoke about the impact of climate and climate change on human geography and population. But here we're seeing that how just your everyday point of taking a breath is today, makes you vulnerable. And so I think we see that public health is a global public good. And also within the context of multilateralism, as you framed it, it's the weakest part of multilateralism. We've seen it, cooperation is at the most minimal level. And I think that is the kind of state of play that we have today. And given that kind, I think, what are the three things that stand out for me, which necessitates, what we need to do to reinvent going ahead? I think the first point, of course, it's been mentioned already, is, the absence of leadership. At the global level, we are still not having a UN Security Council resolution. That tells you security is not just about, where the guns are and where the borders stand. As somebody said in the discussion, the pandemic doesn't require a passport, right? And security is inclusive, it's state and human. And we're seeing the lack of leadership, at the time when we needed it most, right? And I mean, so multilateralism at its weakest, stretched to the limit, where institutional apathy is staring at us, So second, what it has done, while we see that at play, there's also a big push and talk about, cooperation. So there's a huge expectation which is built up, as if all our animosities and contestations will fade away. And this will just automatically create a point of cooperation. So we're staring at a huge, expectation and response gap, so to speak, yes. Because this has also become the greatest moment of contestation and competition. I mean, just see the development of the vaccine. There's so many labs working, basically at cross purposes, whereas all scientific knowledge could have been pooled, and we could have probably, the first time in history, showed how we could collectively speeden up bringing a vaccine forward. But it has become a national prestige issue. Who comes forward first? It's that moment of science rather than cooperation. And I think going forward, especially when you're looking at what is coming in terms of global leadership, two things have really been missing. One is coherence and legitimacy. We've not had coherence from the top. And wherever you had, if you just take this whole debate about, whether the WHO stood by itself, was it leaning or not, or was it, all of that has put legitimacy of, collectively created institutions at stake. And that means that whatever is coming from such institutions are then not received at the national level with the same kind of earnestness. And I think that's very important. So what does it open up? I think what we see, and the colleagues have already reinforced this, I think we also will need multi-level leadership in multiple formats. I don't think that the scale at which we're dealing with can only have a global response. So regions, like you've also said, are going to become important. Regions may be the key we hold in our hands. We don't realize it. If a region is secured, at a first level in the pandemic, you probably have, already, fought your first battle. So we have to ask that, how do we then strengthen ASEM, given that, we have the summit later on in the year, and, that point in November could be a point to reflect that we took stock now. So I would really suggest a policy paper, short one page to ASEM, that how do we go ahead? How do we make this truly happen? Second is, I think what we are seeing is the absence of trust at the global level. And this has always been there, and this has been exacerbated. And so, the rebuilding of trust is going to be so essential to cooperation and basically to multilateralism. So right. Multilateralism 2.0 with trust, I think, is going to be important. And, I want to just say two quick concluding points over here. And that means going forward should be different from what it was till where we have reached in this race together. It should be going forward with equity, justice, access, and inclusion for all. I mean, we can't create a divided world again. That means we have learned nothing collectively. Right. And I think that is this moment. It cannot be business as usual, as the friends have said in the discussion. Right. But I mean, if it is going forward, how? Yeah. I think it's so important to think of, access and equity for all. Because like I said, we have pushed people back. The pandemic has pushed people into poverty. Well-being has been stripped away. And that's like, more than 50, 60 decades of right. development has gone. Right. So I think my final point, recovery obviously cannot be regional. Recovery has to be global. There are global supply chains, there are global interconnections. So we can't think of piecemeal recovery. It has to be global. It has to be sustainable. And it requires both cooperation and connectivity. The two things, pillars, which are part of the ASEM, right? And probably I think it's a question for all of us to talk, for EU, for India, for China, for Japan, everybody around the table. Is it a moment to reinvent foreign policy of a different kind? Because national interest will only mean that you're taking the first road to exit into nowhere. the pandemic is going to be with us for a very long time. It has shown that you cannot function and deliver like this, right?
Right.
It means that you have to think of collective first, and national will be a part of that integral collective. So I think that is my first few comments.
Thank you Salma, as always, for being very complete and very, very, I have to say, also inspirational. Health, public good, lack of leadership, recovery cannot be regional, has to be global, and also the importance of cooperation and connectivity going forward. I see the skeleton of a new paper being developed here among us, something we should talk about as we go into the pre-ASEM Asia-Europe meeting that you've been referring to. You'll be getting some calls from us, right, Amanda? Okay, Bart, you're always the most patient one of us, and you're always the one who listens and then comes in and gives us your views. So Bart, you've been following ASEM for as long as Lewi, Salma, and I have been. Being passionate about it, even when people used to disregard it as a talk shop and weren't investing any time, energy, or effort into it, we still believed in it. So Bart, floor's yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Shada. Just what I see are three key issues for the way forward from now on. I think the first one has been mentioned already a few times, and that is the need to emphasize multilateralism. I think the COVID-19 crisis only intensified this crisis of multilateralism that was already ongoing before the pandemic started. States have been taking unilateral actions also in Europe. States have been even abusing the crisis for their own nationalistic purposes. There has also been maybe a bit of a less of a coherent response to this crisis compared to other crises like the financial crisis or the SARS epidemic and so on. So I think there's really need for Europe and Asia to come together and make a strong stance against unilateralism and for multilateralism. And I think that Asia as well as Europe are home to quite a few small states, middle powers that stand to gain most from a stronger multilateral system. So I think that's the first key issue that Europe and Asia should be working on. Second key issue area, I think, is digital connectivity. We're now in a virtual seminar. We've all been teleworking quite a lot. So I think this crisis has shown that there is still a lot of scope for cooperation and even necessity to cooperate more on digital connectivity in all its fields, including privacy, data protection, cybersecurity, e-commerce, and so on. So I think that the crisis has only pushed this theme more to the fore, and that will become, I hope, another key issue or a second key issue area for cooperation from now on. And then maybe a third key issue area, which is that I think one lesson that we've learned is that Asian countries compared to European ones have dealt with this crisis much better than, well, most European states, and well, exactly because they have had more experience with the outbreak of certain pandemics in former years, like the SARS outbreak in 2002 and 2003. So I think this time around, we in Europe should also be ready to learn more from Asia. Things have often been the way around. Europe has often been accused of preaching to Asians, maybe have been too eager to promote their own model of integration, for example. I think now it's a time to reflect a bit on that and to maybe turn the tables and to be also willing to learn from Asia in that field of how to spread these pandemics and how to tackle them in the most ideal way. I think those are my three areas.
Thank you very much, Bart. I see absolutely the need for, we've always talked about connectivity in the ASEM context, the digital side of it. I mean, we're seeing it now, and I have to say, I'm very moved to have all of you here talking about this. And the fact that you've said that we should be learning from Asia, I think this is something that for years we've been saying, 4, 5, 6, 7, all of us here. But message hasn't really been understood. And there is absolutely a need to stop this, what our friend Philomena Murray has called regionalism snobbery on the part of the European Union, and to actually engage with Asia in a more, let's say, collective and cooperative fashion. Professor Shifulin and Wenfeng, if I may come back to you, we've talked about the broader picture of Asia-Europe, and now I just want to sort of go slightly deeper into the bilateral relationships that your countries have with the European Union. And once again, it's the independence of our network here that is a priority. We are not speaking on behalf of any country or any, let's say, political party here. We're all independent experts. So Professor Shifulin, we've heard a lot about, and I know that you've been pushing for years for Europe-China free trade agreement. You've also been pushing for closer cooperation on investments. And now, of course, the relationship is rather strained. I always say EU-China relations are a bit of a roller coaster ride, up one day, down the other. We cooperate, we compete, we converge, we diverge. So Wenfeng and Professor Shifulin, tell us a few words about your ideas about how we can maybe take the relationship in a new direction, please.
Okay, Sada, I please wait for me, okay?
Yeah, okay. So thank you, Shada. So I'll just speak on the Professor Chi's behalf. That's right, Shada. It is important that at this time that is probably not a matter of which side to choose between China and the US, but it is more important that to make a choice between this multilateralism-based globalization or this trade protection-based anti-globalization. So for this, that we think that we'd like to come up with three suggestions, three ideas on what about this China-EU economic and trade cooperation at a historical crossroad. So the first one, of course, we say that I think it's important really we uphold this multilateral principles. This will be a strategic choice for both China and EU, because as we can see that, and also many experts say that this COVID-19 is significantly changing this external and internal environments. We see this regionalization of the supply chain, localization of the supply chain. At the same time, you also see some rise in this isolationism, unilateralism, nationalism, trade protectionism, etc., etc. So it means that the relations between major economies, are having this more complicated changes. So at this time of the historical crossroad, we really, both China and EU really should firmly uphold this multilateralism, and we work together and to handle with this anti-globalization. This is a strategic choice for both of us. The second one is to be more practical. Another practical choice that is both China and EU work together to build a bigger integrated market. When it comes to the economic structure for both China and the EU, we are more of being complementary than being competitive, especially when it comes to this the service trade. There's huge potential that needs to be tapped. So as this China is really tapping its potential of its consumption, its huge consumption of 1.4 billion, with a huge number of middle class people. And then if we are able to make this a bigger market, bigger integrated market between China and the EU, it will really further unleash the huge potential of this the trading investment between China and EU. This will not only help to boost this economic recovery of the EU, to stabilize its economy, but it will also, really tap in this huge potential of China's market. The third one is just, as you mentioned, Shada, that professors has been advocating that we really need to speed up this investment treaty between China and EU, and then we need to start this FTA negotiation as soon as possible. This is another important strategic choice for China and EU to deepen the economic and trade cooperation. Of course, because to further to the second point, if we are to unleash this, untap this huge potential, it is really relies on this institutional arrangements of the free trade between China and EU. So, but currently, this is the major the barriers for that. So, if we are able to conclude this BIT negotiation, say this year in 2020, and then we start this feasibility study of this FTA, of China-EU FTA. And this will probably send a strong signal to the world that two major economies in the world are making efforts to promote this free trade process. This is sending a strong signal, and is to inject this trust and confidence in energy to this world that has been heavily impacted by the COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Shifulin and Wenfeng. Professor has, of course, written an article on this topic that will be coming out in our new EU-China discussion paper later this year. And I know that you've been a passionate advocate for this FTA. I like very much what you've said also about services, Professor Shifulin. I remember you came to our Friends of Europe Forum, Europe-China Forum, and talked about services and the growth industry and the growth potential. I think almost 4 years ago. And you also then, I remember very well, Professor, highlighted the importance of the health sector, services, health sector. So thank you for your very visionary comments. And as I said, the focus you put on multilateralism is key, I think, to the future. Let me turn now, thank you so much, Lei Wei. So ASEAN, for a long time, ASEAN was also talked about in rather, let's say, I was going to say derogatory, but that's not the word, but in a different way than it is now. ASEAN has grown in economic influence and in political influence, and now seen very much as part of the geopolitical game, if you like, that's being played across the world. Some of it nasty, some of it okay. How has ASEAN dealt with the COVID-19? Has there been the same kind of rupture and disruption, at least initially, that we've seen here in Europe? Has there been a more sort of coordinated approach happening in ASEAN than we've seen in other parts of the world, perhaps?
I think first, of course, we have to recognize that ASEAN is an intergovernmental organization, right? And its decisions and all that are based on consultation and consensus. So we cannot expect too much from a lot of what ASEAN does is, in a sense, more supportive of what each member state is doing. And actually, contrary to belief, yes, there was, of course, very national response, which I think is seen everywhere. But actually, ASEAN, right from the beginning, on the 30th of January, the senior health officials, ASEAN senior health officials and experts already start meeting to say that we should get together to exchange information and get prepared. So I think ASEAN has actually not been done so badly. If you think of it, again, you have to understand the nature of ASEAN, right? It is not like the EU, and even in EU, we know, which has all its institutions and where it has the cardinal for freedom of movement, and yet member states in the initial response was the thing to do was to close borders, export controls. And in the case of ASEAN, I think a lot of concerted efforts. So you have a series of meetings starting already from January, and then there's a meeting with the Chinese government, with the foreign minister in February. And in all this, of course, a lot of it's based on exchange of information and certain coordination efforts, not so much. But so I think, I personally think that there's a tendency to underrate or underestimate ASEAN. But I think we have come out of this. There are, of course, still shortcomings, because a lot of how the ASEAN member states can deal with the COVID-19, of course, depends on the state capacity. And some of these ASEAN countries, of course, need quite a bit of help. And you could see that kind of bilateral and trilateral efforts from different ASEAN member states. For instance, Singapore sending medical kits and test kits to Myanmar. You have Vietnam, putting in efforts to help Laos and all that. So you see a lot of this kind of, as I said, efforts at various levels, not just at the regional level. And I mean, I'm also happy to say that it was good to see the video conference between EU and ASEAN on the, I think it was on the 30th of March.
Yes, very early on.
Yeah, where I think it's to me, it reflects a certain seriousness when they talk about EU and ASEAN becoming strategic partners, right? And this meeting took place early on, where they again emphasized the need for much more regional cooperation and inter-regional cooperation. So in that sense, I would say ASEAN has done quite well. And of course, there are different responses and different state capacity. But overall, I think ASEAN has managed the COVID-19 pandemic in a good way.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you. Amanda, can I just turn to you now, because I'm going to do another, of course, I'm going to go to all of you again. But I was just wondering, Amanda, do you have an additional question that you would like to put in here? So when I go back to our panelists, though, they can also deal with that question, because we've got about 15 minutes left.
Absolutely. I will put in two questions that I've received from Twitter and via email. The first question that we've received from our viewers is, shouldn't EU and Asia emphasize more their common points, like higher social awareness in contrast to exaggerated personal individualism that has led to a Westlessness, and now even more to loss of life in coronavirus in Anglo-Saxon countries? So that's one question we've received. And then the second question would be about digital connectivity and health as a global public good, which have both been mentioned. So what about the health and digital Silk Roads? Are these some of the answers we're looking for, or what other platforms could we be looking to? Those are the questions we've received today.
Thank you so much, Amanda, for coming in. So I'm going to go back to the panelists, and while you answer questions, please do keep these very important points in view as well. So Joe, let's go to you on this. Also, maybe a word about how Europe now views Asia and the upcoming Asia-Europe meeting, but also the two questions on that Amanda has just put forward, please.
Yeah, to the first question that was put via Twitter. Indeed, Western individualism and more Asian collective thinking and decision making. I think that democracies have their weak points because it takes sometimes long to decide. But on the other end, and you could see it in most countries in Europe, that people trust their government. And I think trust is a very important thing today in a modern society, more than it might have been in the past. And I think that transparency and trust is a cornerstone of well-functioning state and well-functioning crisis management. And therefore, yes, we are a bit slow. For example, the Corona app, we are debating since weeks whether we get that up on our iPhones and mobile phones, and then we could really trace all infections. That was very well done in Singapore, in South Korea, and we have to learn, and maybe in China as well. But democracies struggle a little bit more. Now, I would as well say that Asia and Europe is a huge point for cooperation. And our High Representative was quoted the other day, Europe has to choose between China and the US. I hope he will reflect again on this quote, because we should not be hostage, both the Asian countries as the European countries, of this rivalry between the US and China. We should free ourselves from this dividing the world in two parts, in the China world and the American world. There will not be a Pax Sinica, and there will no more be a Pax Americana. So I join my colleagues who argued for functional leadership, for coalition of the willing, according to the topics. And Asia and Europe, we have a lot of them. In the economics, we have to keep the world open. We have to make all these trade agreements Europe has done recently with Japan, with Singapore, with Vietnam, South Korea some years ago. We hope that the investment agreement with China will take place on the EU-China summit in Leipzig. Hopefully it takes place in September. where all the 27 member states take part with the Chinese leadership. Yeah, we have a few issues like reciprocity, transparency. It's not yet easy, but I hope where there is a will, there is a way. I hope that we can get ahead with India. Since years, we discuss the free trade agreement. It should come really to the table now and be done. Now, not to be too long, we have now the coronavirus. Shada, you know that I was busy for years in the Environment Committee and the climate issue. We have the fossil virus. And indeed, ASEM meeting should focus on recovery plans that support the future and not the past. We should not, with all the billions and trillions, support, let's say, industries that might be critical looking on climate protection. And therefore, I think all this money should go in modern technology and sustainable developments. I would finish with one point, digitalization. Yes, we are now on Zoom, and the big digital companies get even more powerful than they are today. What are they doing with our data? What is about the misinformation and fake news? And I think we should work on a rule book governing the internet. It's so important, and connectivity is so much depending in the future on a good governed internet, and ASEM and Europe should work for this. So a lot of issues, and looking forward to the summit in Cambodia.
Thank you very much, Joe, for making some very, very powerful points. We will consider these as important food for thought, really. Thank you so much indeed. Kiki, can I get your comments, please?
Yes. Well, yesterday, Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe had a video conference with EU leaders, namely with Mr. Michel and Dr. von der Leyen, and have reaffirmed that EU and Japan will work together in responding to this global challenge. Things they have agreed is quite a long list, and it is available in a press statement. So I'm not going to cover them. I would like to stress, however, that they have agreed that global solidarity, cooperation, effective multilateralism are required more than ever to defeat the virus, as well as to ensure economic recovery. This is very important in the context of EU-Asia as well, I believe. Another point is global collaboration and sustained funding for developing and deploying effective antiviral medicines, diagnostics, treatments, and vaccines in order to make them affordable to all at an affordable price. There are other important issues covered here, but from my personal note, I would like to point out that new coronavirus did not bring crisis alone. It is offering new opportunities for us to work together. We have been talking about ASEM, and I agree with many of the points already made. ASEM has been working on common issues of EU and Asia, but I'm afraid we were not on the same page exactly. We're in the same book, but may not be on the same page. But on this new coronavirus, we are exactly on the same page, aren't we? And November meeting, or a meeting to take place towards the end of this year of ASEM, would be a great platform for us to show what we mean by our cooperation. We have talked in length about multilateralism, and I have received comments being very supportive of multilateralism. But in order to prevent multilateralism to wane anymore, I think this COVID-19 is testing us to reshape multilateralism so that it is acceptable and beneficial for all of us. Again, if I may borrow from Joe, it has to be resilient multilateralism. And as for trade, I think we should look at digital issues, internet issues as well. WTO has problems, but the digital is a common interest as well as a challenge, as was already mentioned, and that has to be worked out together. So those are the issues I'd like to leave with you.
Thank you very much indeed, Kiki. We are in reading the same book, but not on the same page. I think you're absolutely right. Mr. Lirong, let me come back to you and also ask you basically the same question I put to Professor Shifulin. A lot of focus on China, a lot of acrimony, a lot of blame games. Targeting China, but China also being more self-assertive, more self-confident, and slightly diplomatically awkward at some moments. How do you see this relationship moving forward? And to answer also the questions about ASEM, Asia-Europe meeting, where do you think we should be focusing when we go forward? Is it the digital Silk Road? Is it the health Silk Road? Please.
Yeah. I would like to start to answer the question raised a few minutes before, if it will be a China century or Asian century.
Please.
I wouldn't call it a China century, but I do see lots of changes are taking place, great changes in the world, which we haven't seen before. But whatever changes taking place, China, or how strong China will be, China will not replace US as the leading country in the world, or dominating country, or China will not pursue hegemony. Even when China becomes the biggest economy in the world. And regarding the current Sino-American relationship, we see it worsening from month to month, which we were not happy to see. We don't think that China and US should be confrontational. We still should work together because we live in the same world. And how big changes taking place, China will play a constructive and positive role on the international arena. And we are not happy to see that some Americans or some American politicians would like to start a new Cold War against China, maybe out of their strategic intentions or out of election considerations. But it's not good for Sino-American relations, neither for the whole world, because in that situation, as Joe mentioned, other countries probably should choose sides, which is not good, beneficial for neither China or America or other countries. We didn't start the process talking about the decoupling or the disinformation war against China. We have seen so many slandering remarks against China, which does not align with the truth. So whatever happens, I think China will like to see that the US comes back to the world family and plays its or takes its responsibility. But at the same time, we support the principle of multilateralism as the EU does, because we think we are living in a changing world. Every country should be equal, and the big decisions should be reached through consultation and discussion among countries. With regard to the China-Europe relations, I would tell that this year marks the 45th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic ties between China and EU. And in the last decades, although there were ups and downs, we made remarkable achievements in our relationship. EU has over the many years, the biggest trading partner of China, amounting to $680 billion last year. But we have a lot of potentials to exploit in the future. If we say there are 1,000 reasons for a good China-US relationship, I would say there are 1,001 reasons for better China-EU relations.
Right.
And that extra point is we both support multilateralism, and that's our common ground. And we have we share similar and same views on many international issues, like upholding the authority of the United Nations and other international organizations, like climate change and UN 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. I think China and EU and Asia and EU should play a bigger role on the international arena.
Right.
And in the respect of ASEAN, which represents actually more than half of the world GDP and 6% of the world population and trade, should play a bigger role, should be, I think, one of the major cornerstones of the global governance in the future. And in that sense, I think we can work together on fighting the virus, first of all, and we can work together on the recovery of the world economy, and we also should support the international organizations in playing a greater role against the backdrop that the US has withdrawn from so many organizations, like climate change treaty, like the UNESCO, like even the Iran nuclear treaty.
Yes, Mr. Lirong, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
It's funded to WHO.
Right.
Yeah. And lastly, I would say I do support the idea of digital Silk Road. We can exploit possibilities. And I think Asia and Europe should learn from each other and work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I now have Selma and Bart coming in, and we have about, we're overshot our timeline, but that's fine. We're having a brilliant conversation. So we have about 10 more minutes. If I could ask both of you to stay within the 3-minute time limit, and then we can, I can round up. So Selma, please. And as Joe said, he wants things to move forward with India as well. So bring that into your comments, please.
Thank you, Shada. I think the summit has been postponed, the India-EU summit, and probably that's a good point of stock taking as to how we could take the partnership forward. I think it has to be also taken forward from an opportunity to take it forward from an ideational level to a very pragmatic kind of a partnership, and to move beyond, I think, what I would call a demand-supply kind of a relationship, where it's not just about production of rules at one part of the world and consumption by another part. Joe pointed about the learning, and others have also said which could be done from other parts of the world. And I think that's precisely three things I want to point out over here on the India-EU. I think I see opportunity for real joint partnership in the health sector, which this pandemic has created. Whether taking the vaccine development forward, let's keep in mind India is one of the world's largest, manufacturers of vaccines. Once it is done wherever, it will come to India to get produced. So how do we bring it together? Migration is going to be extremely important. The unsung voices who actually drive our economies have become the face of the pandemic, so to speak. And Joe, you were right, they are pictures of pain, but I think India has also shown how it stepped in early to manage. This is a point where every country has missed many points on the agenda, because this was something we've never prepared for. We've never prepared for a war on a humanitarian scale like this. So there are going to be lapses, I agree, and every country will have to do with stock taking. So I think migration in terms of what can be allowed is going to be important. The biggest beneficiary of the lockdown has been the climate. You have not needed technology. In fact, the absence of technology has led to cleaner air around the world. We've experienced the cleanest air in New Delhi, for example. So that connects with trade. A sustainable green economic recovery is the way forward on one point. A second thing, digital has come up again, and I think we see the impact of the digital transformation. My concern is, and I would flag it for the India-EU, is how do we transform, because it is transforming employment as we speak. And it is going to produce more unemployment and a digital divide, because you'll have to see how the scientific creation and the knowledge landscape is being totally transformed. Joe, you also pointed about data, issues with data privacy, right? All of what we are producing today is already part of somebody else's repertoire, right? What does that mean for us, open societies with technology that is sustainable? I think that is very important. And a third point I think is also to ask is, as India and EU go ahead, I think we have to remember that we are in bilateral, but we're in sets of multiple dyadic relations, and things which are going to happen in the other part of the world is going to impact Europe, is going to impact EU, and is going to impact India. So I think there will be a tendency to be, looking at what is happening domestically. My fear is that we will be caught by the domestics, the urgency for the immediate, tensions on the line of control, for example, that may consume you more than reaching out and saying, how do we transcend the pandemic? Having said that, I think we are facing in India such an economic downturn that you talked about the trade partnership. We will have to revisit the entire way we are going to do this trade equation now. It cannot be business as usual, and to my mind, I think let us start with the human security first. Let's place that at the center of the equation. Like I said, health, migration, climate, and trade will automatically be a part of this equation.
Thank you very much, Salma, indeed, for those words. But as usual, coming in last with your wisdom, please.
Well, maybe one short note on ASEM. I think, the forthcoming summit is going to take place under the theme of strengthening multilateralism for shared growth. So it's my expectation. I think we should be rather optimistic that the summit can deliver a quite strong message, be it on multilateralism or on sustainable development or on a possible public health partnership. Of course, that may not seem very easy because ASEM is so diverse and so different and divided as well. But I do think that there is a good chance that the leaders will find the political will to actually deliver such a strong message. And I say that because it's actually based on the past. In past 24 years, I think ASEM has shown on multiple occasions that it can come out with quite strong declarations, and more importantly, also follow up those declarations with some tangible outcomes, initiatives in the ASEM context. There's plenty of examples. There's not much time to go into those. It starts with the Asia financial crisis, 98, all the way to the aftermath of 9/11, the declaration on fight against terrorism and actions in that field, all the way to 2008, the actions as well as declarations on the occasion of the global financial crisis. So I do think that there is a good hope that we can expect something similar from the upcoming summit in words as well as in actions, the summit that will be taking place in Cambodia in November. Still about or maybe quick response to the two questions on Twitter. Should we focus more on commonalities? Yes, and here I would like to echo what Lei Wei already mentioned in the beginning, the need to create these coalitions of the willing. I think it's no longer necessary to agree with a certain country about everything, as long as there is scope for cooperation on a certain few issues. So Europe, for example, can cooperate with Japan and India on public health issues, or with ASEAN on connectivity and so on. So this kind of coalition-based cooperation, issue-based leadership, I think is the way forward from now on. And maybe you can call that minilateralism as maybe a second best option as compared to multilateralism. About the digital Silk Road, I also agree that it's the way forward for cooperation in the ASEM context. The problem is that digital Silk Road has a bit of a negative connotation because of its link with the China-US competition on 5G. But I think here it is important to keep in mind that it's not actually a Chinese invention, but it was actually first brought up, digital Silk Road, that is, by former South Korean President Kim Dae-jung in 2002, and actually in the ASEM context, which was followed by a digital Silk Road project in ASEM, which then led to the Trans-Eurasian Information Network set up jointly between research institutes based in Europe as well as Asia. So I think that it's important to build on those kind of experiences that go back quite a long way in ASEM's history, and link it with European priorities. For example, Europe has its Digital for Development initiative, linking digital connectivity with social development. In this case, it can also be linked with public health partnerships and so on. So I think that this idea of digital Silk Road needs to be taken away from its negative connotation and well, be reinvented in the ASEM context also as the way forward for now.
Thank you very much, Bart. I was wondering, Wenfeng, do you want to just say something very quickly at this point, or can we conclude?
Yes, just very brief comments.
Total 2 minutes, okay. 我想疫情以后，全球面临一个最大的风险选择，就是全球化是往前走还是往后退。
So I think the biggest the issue for the world is after this COVID-19 is whether the globalization is moving forward or moving back.
在这个背景下，我想中国怎么选择有3点很重要。
So what choices China is going to make? I think there are 3 points that are very important.
第一是中国坚持多边主义，推动全球化，比如说尽到大国的责任。最近呢，我们宣布的疫苗如果成功以后，我们把它作为一个全球的公共产品，这就是一个例子。在这方面会采取更多的措施。
So the first one is we have to uphold this multilateralism and promote globalization. One example is that China just announced that if we are able to once we have developed the vaccines of COVID-19, we're going to make it available to everybody, make it a global public good.
第二，我们加快推进开放转型。那么我们现在加快的从要素市场向规则为重点的制度性开放这个提升。
The second one is we have further advanced promote this high level of opening up, changing from this production factor based to this rule based institutional opening up.
在这个背景下，服务业和服务贸易开放将是中国下一步的重中之重。
And the service sector, the service trade is going to be the priority of the priorities.
过几天呢，可能将正式公布海南自由贸易港的制度和政策设计，大家会看到这是一个相当开放的一个措施。
So in a couple of days, you may see that the new publication of this the policies of this Hainan Free Trade Port, and then you'll see how open that could be.
第三就是以高水平开放来促进和倒逼中国的内部的市场化改革。
So the third one is we push and force this internal reforms through this high-level opening up.
中国在最近的不到1个月连发2个重要文件，中央政府一个要素市场化改革，第二个关于完善市场经济体制改革，提出了以高水平开放促进深层次的市场化改革。我呢，过几天可能会在《人民日报》有一篇文章来阐述这个问题。
So recently, the Chinese central government just published two policies. The first one is this having this high level of opening up of this reform of these production factors. The second one is that just promoting these reforms and deeper reforms with this opening up. And probably in a few days, professors will publish his article in China's most influential newspaper, People's Daily.
Thank you.
Thank you. Friends and colleagues, thank you very much for joining this, I think, absolutely brilliant conversation. And what I loved about it also is the positive note in it. And I think in these dark and dangerous times, it's the positivity and the constructive approach rather than these geopolitical blame games that is a winner, frankly, in the name of humanity. I'm not going to try and summarize what has been absolutely enriching. We've talked about, but let me just say a few highlights that have stuck with me, and I'm obviously going to forget quite a few. That's inevitable. We've really focused with Parag and then with you 7 brilliant people, we focused on regionalism, the growing importance of regions in supply chains as well as in cooperation, but that doesn't exclude multilateral contacts and building a multilateral order. It has to be an inclusive multilateral order. We have to work, we have to compete, but as many of you have said, issue-based leadership is going to be the way forward. Leadership, wise leadership, will matter even more than ever before. We've talked about the importance of health, and as we go towards the Asia-Europe meeting in Cambodia later this year, I think inevitably health issues, health infrastructure, the fragilities of our health structures and how we can improve them, but also free movement, lowering tariffs on medical products, not hoarding protective gear, sharing and allowing doctors, nurses, health workers to travel freely from one country to another. That's been a long-standing issue in the WTO, put in, among others, by India. But I think that makes it even more imperative that we look at it. The digital issue. We're now together. In fact, we couldn't be doing this if we didn't have digital technology at our fingertips. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but we have the ethics and we have a digital divide. It's not just a north-south, east-west divide, it's a societal divide. And we haven't talked about how women are often not part of the story because in many countries, they do not have access to digital technology. And when they do, they are empowered and they are really important as well. So we need to reshape and redesign the multilateral order. And all of you have focused on that. We've also focused on the need for global governance, better forms of global governance. And one thing that stuck with me, and I think all of you have said this, and Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, the need to learn from each other. We have to now drop all pretense at knowing it all. We don't know it all. And we have pockets of knowledge, large swathes of knowledge across the world that sometimes we, all of us, do not tap into because we're part of a geopolitical blame games. And I think this is something that all of us have also stressed over and over again. We have to free ourselves of this rivalry. It's destructive and it's not working for humanity or for the nations either. So let's put the public good, the common public good in front when we talk about the way forward. And there, all of you have said it, and I believe it very, very sincerely, very passionately. The Asia-Europe meeting, the Asia-Europe connection is vital. So let's make this time more than ever before, let's make it work. And let's turn it into really a part of the new global governance system. So if I could just say to you all, dear friends, it's been a pleasure to work with you throughout these years. And it's a pleasure to have you all together at this wonderful moment, sharing our thoughts and our hopes for the future. So stay well, stay safe, and all of you watching us, students and everyone else, thank you so much for being online. I hope you've learned as much as I have. And as I said, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay well. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Shada.